When Intel's Arc GPUs came out, they honestly had a pretty horrible launch from a software support. A lot of games just didn't work. There was a lot of other bugs, and I've tested them out a few times since then, but there have been driver update after driver update promising massive improvements. What's the actual experience like? In 2024, is Arc actually the way to go? You can get a 16GB Arc A770 for the same price as an RTX 4060. Let's actually take a quick look at that. If I wanted to if I wanted to buy an Arc A770 16GB version right now, by the way, the Acer Predator Bifrost is the version I am testing in this video, it's $285. If I wanted to buy an RTX 4060, which is only an 8GB graphics card, it's $285 for the cheapest models. I have the Asus Dual that I'm testing out here, which would currently be $305. No, so that means that we are doing similar price graphics cards. One gives you twice the VRAM. There's been tons of driver improvements. So what is the actual experience? Well, unfortunately, I absolutely hated my time testing this thing out. So let me just kind of go through the highlights here. Do you see this frame time graph here? This is really, really spiky. This frame time graph is pretty smooth. So that's honestly one of the biggest issues I found in Avatar: Frontiers of Pandora, which is one of the newest, most graphically demanding, showcase games. This is on Ubisoft's Snowdrop engine. I tried a variety of graphics settings, even frame generation when it's available. This game has FSR3 frame generation, which we're looking at here. So this is FSR3 quality frame generation on both GPUs. And we can see that the 1% lows here are at 9 frames per second, 10 by the end of this run. Look at this frame time graph. It's just all over the place, not having a great experience here. Tried going down to high settings to see if things would improve, but again, the RTX 4060 is offering over double the 1% lows, and again, that shows up in this frame time graph. The frame time graph here is just not good on the A770. Now, some of you might be wondering, hey, are you sure you're using ResizeBAR? Because Intel Arc GPUs do need ResizeBAR enabled to function properly, and yes, I am. I'm running the GPUs at their out-of-the-box settings, but out-of-the-box settings on the AM5 platform that I'm using does include ResizeBAR, so that is enabled on both systems. Now, a lot of people have pointed out that Intel Arc GPUs do scale better to 1440p than some of their counterparts. And you can see here that in the averages, the 4060 is only 12% ahead now, but in the 1% lows, it's 26 versus 9. Now, I tried turning down to the high settings because the overall frame rates were pretty bad on both GPUs. And now look what happened. The A770 is now outputting the split video to my capture card. To be clear, I'm capturing everything on an external capture card, which I guess the GPUs should pretty much just read as a monitor, and that's being captured on a second PC to not impact performance. But for whatever reasons, at 1440p high settings, it just wanted to output like that. And actually, if you look at here with FSR and DLSS enabled, which we're looking at here, you can see that it's still split just a little bit up here at the top, so something's still a little bit off, although the high settings, again, after multiple restarts, just couldn't make them look normal. But anyway, here we're seeing 40 FPS on the A770, 60 on the 4060. That's a 50% advantage for the 4060, but the 1% lows are tripling because, again, the frame time graph is all over the place. And again, going down to FSR3 quality settings at the high preset with frame generation enabled, the 4060's doing a pretty good job over here. Whereas again, our frame time graph is all over the place. We're down here in the teens on the Arc A770. Again, the video feed's a little bit split. So anyway, I guess what I'm saying is it just wasn't a great experience in Avatar. So I popped up my other big new graphically demanding game I usually use to test things out. And this is Alan Wake 2. Now, Alan Wake 2 is not running properly here. As you can see on the RTX 4060, I can go to low settings DLSS quality and get kind of a 60 FPS experience. It's fine. It's a pretty demanding game. On the Arc A770 over here, you can see the GPU usage is only reporting at like 3 or 4%, and the power draw here is only reporting at 33 watts. So basically, for whatever reason, it's just not really using the A770 when I load up this game. And I can't tell you for sure why. I'm wondering if it's trying to run on the integrated GPU that's built in my CPU, but I did tell Windows to prefer Alan Wake 2. I could have tried disabling it in BIOS, but I'm trying to test out-of-the-box settings. So that was a frustrating experience in Alan Wake 2. We'll call that one a loss. So how about Starfield? This was one of the biggest PC game launches this year. I know it hasn't necessarily been received super well by everybody, but it was a big launch. It didn't run at all when it first came out. It now runs, but look at this frame time graph again. It's extremely spiky. We see a few spikes here and there on the 4060, but it's very spiky. I'm trying to kick down to XeSS quality settings here versus DLSS, by the way. And I will say that's a highlight. The XeSS upscaling is a better competitor to DLSS than FSR is. So at least they have that, a nice machine learning upscaler. But again, the frame time graph is all over the place here. We're seeing a 42% lead for the 4060 in the averages and a 57% lead in the 1% lows. It's just not that great of an experience. Now, this game does have frame generation for FSR and DLSS. It doesn't, XeSS doesn't have a frame generation version here. So for frame generation purposes, I had to drop down to FSR for the upscaler and frame generation for the A770. Still not really solving the spiky frame time graph issues. Not that the 4060 is perfectly smooth, but it's much better, especially, again, you can see it in the 1% lows. I tried dropping down to medium settings instead of ultra to see if that would help things out. Now the 4060 is averaging over 70 FPS here in New Atlantis, but the A770 is averaging only 45 with 32 in the 1% lows and still a pretty spiky frame time graph. We got a 66% lead here in the 1% lows and a 56% lead in the averages. So just overall, not a great experience here. Now I tried moving up to 1440p. And again, the averages actually close in a bit here. The 4060 only winning by 17% in the averages at 1440p Ultra, but the 1% lows are 28 versus 19. Again, we see the spiky frame time graph. And overall, it's not really a great experience at these settings on either GPU. So if we go ahead and kind of skip forward a bit here, if I try kicking on XeSS and DLSS upscaling, the 4060 gains more performance than the A770 does from lowering the internal resolution. The frame time graphs still look very spiky relatively on the A770, and the performance lead jumps to 26% in the averages, but 50% in the 1% lows on the 4060. I tried going down to medium settings with quality level upscaling, where now the RTX 4060 is averaging 71 frames per second, giving it a 58% lead over the 45 FPS on the A770, and the 1% lows are even worse at 54 versus 33. Again, you can kick on frame generation, and the 4060 has access to the DLSS frame generation, as well as higher base frame rate to work from. The A770 here, again, still has a less smooth frame time graph and has to use the FSR version of the upscaling and frame generation, which generally is of a bit lower image quality. Let's move on to an Unreal Engine 5 game. I'm taking a look at RoboCop Rogue City here at 1080p epic settings. The 4060 is able to average just under 60 FPS at 56, whereas the A770 is hitting 44. So it's a 27% lead for the RTX 4060. If we go down to high settings, now the 4060 is actually over 60 FPS at 64, but the A770 is only at 49, and the 4060 has expanded its lead to 31% in the averages. At least this time, though, the frame time graphs don't look crazy bad on the A770, so at least you have a smoother experience than what we saw in a lot of those other tests. At 1440p epic settings, neither GPU is doing great, and the A770 closes in a bit here, but it's still a 13% advantage for the 4060 at 36 versus 32. And then I also tried kicking on upscaling. Now this game does have XeSS upscaling available, which is nice. It has DLSS upscaling available as well as DLSS frame generation. Without frame generation, we have a 30% lead at 56 versus 43. And then again, you can kick on frame generation on top of that, and this is a fairly decent base frame rate from which to kick on frame generation. You could also try going down to high settings, which I did here, which still isn't great performance. We're at 42 versus 36, so 17% advantage for the 4060. But again, I think you'd probably most likely kick on some upscaling here. So if we go down to high settings with quality level upscaling, again, XeSS versus DLSS at the quality setting, We're now hitting 63 FPS on the 4060. Again, no frame generation here, although you could definitely kick it on. And that's a 34% lead over the 47 FPS on the A770. So again, just better experience here on the 4060. So what about the probably highest rated PC game of the last year with Baldur's Gate 3? Well, wait a second, guys. We've got a win going on here for the A770 by 7%, although the 1% lows are still a little bit better on the 4060. And when we move up to 1440p, the A770 expands its lead in the averages, but not the 1% lows. Look at these spikes. At regular intervals, we're getting these large spikes on the A770, leading the 1% lows to be 49 versus 18. So despite taking a lead in the averages, again, we're getting a more stuttery experience on the A770. There's noticeable frame time spikes at regular intervals. I am testing this game out in DX11 mode since that is the default mode the launcher goes to, so perhaps it would have done better on Vulkan. So then I moved into one of the popular big, multiplayer releases with Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3 at 1080p basic settings. It's not that the A770 isn't usable here, and its frame time graph actually does look fairly smooth. So that's at least good to see. But we're seeing a 71% advantage for the 4060 in the averages and a 39% advantage in the 1% lows. If we move up to 1440p, those gaps do get smaller. And now it's a 47% advantage for the 4060 and a 9% advantage in the 1% lows. So again, as you do increase the resolution, the A770 does close the gap a bit, but this is still a pretty large win for the A770. Now, moving on to Resident Evil 4 Remake. This is the RE engine with 1080p max settings, which are very VRAM hungry. We do see the occasional spike on the 4060 frame time graph, and they're actually about tied here with the A770 having a bit of a lead in the 1% lows. And again, slightly spikier frame time graph on the 4060. Now, if we move down to the prioritized graphics preset, which don't require such a drastic amount of VRAM, both GPUs have a nice flat frame time graph, and here they're actually basically tied in performance. So we're seeing that the A770 can match the performance of the 4060 when when it's the right software. So it's just very inconsistent, but it is able to match the 4060 performance in this game at these settings. And at max settings, 1440p, it's actually a dramatic win for the A770, and check out the frame time graph on the 4060. Here we're seeing a bunch of big spikes. That's because the 4060 is running out of VRAM. We're definitely going over the VRAM buffer. That's causing issues, and that's giving the A770 a 48% advantage in the averages and almost doubling the 1% lows at 52 versus 27. So we're finally seeing that 16 gigabytes of VRAM pay off. However, if we move down to the prioritized graphics preset, which is less VRAM hungry, it's less of a dramatic win, but the A770 still takes the lead here by 11% in the averages at 82 versus 74, and a 9% lead in 1% lows at 72 versus 66. Then moving on to Cyberpunk, we see another win for the A770. At 1080p Ultra, it's winning by 5% in the averages at 79 versus 75, and 13% in the 1% lows at 61 versus 54. However, what if we kick on ray tracing? Well, if we kick on the RT overdrive mode, neither GPU does very well. Although if you want to use frame generation, you can get to around 60 FPS, but 60 FPS achieved through frame generation really, in my opinion, is not a great experience. So this is a 90% win for the 4060, but again, probably not the settings you'd really be using on either GPU. And that was already using quality level upscaling. Now, if we draw back the ray tracing settings to just turning on reflections on top of the Ultra preset, we're now seeing both GPUs a lot more playable, and it's less of a bloodbath. The 4060 is winning by 15% at 55 versus 48. This is with no upscaling. And 13% in the 1% lows at 44 versus 39. And the RT reflections are a pretty meaningful ray tracing setting in this game, so that's definitely something worth taking a look at. Now, if we try upscaling on top of this, we actually see the 4060 go up to a 30% win now And this is XeSS versus DLSS at the quality settings. We're seeing 86 FPS versus 66, 30% lead in the averages, although only 13% lead in the 1% lows. Now that is without frame generation, which again, the NVIDIA GPU does have access to here as well to smooth out frame rates on the high refresh rate display. Now, if we turn off all the ray tracing, but we go up to 1440p resolution, at 1440p Ultra, the A770 takes a pretty commanding 22% lead here, 55 FPS versus 45, and a 25% lead in the 1% lows at 45 versus 36. I'm still not convinced these are exactly the settings that everybody would use. You could try quality level upscaling on top of the Ultra settings. And now we're hitting 66 FPS versus 56, so 18% lead to the A770 and 20% lead in the 1% lows at 55 versus 46. So this definitely is a way you might choose to play the game. But again, you could also drop down to high settings. At the high settings, the A770 still has an advantage, 13% here though, instead of the larger lead we saw at the Ultra settings. And 13% in the 1% lows as well, 62 FPS versus 55, so definitely a way you might play the game. And if you want higher refresh rates, you could kick on the upscaling at the quality setting. Again here, XeSS versus DLSS quality. And again, I do think the XeSS upscaler here looks pretty good here. But now we're actually seeing the 4060 take a lead at 9% in the averages and 3% in the 1% lows. It's 87 versus 80 on the averages here. So what do I think about this overall? So results, like especially when we're looking at like the Ultra settings at 1440p in Cyberpunk. Here we're seeing that Intel certainly can deliver much better experience than the 4060 if all the cards align in the in the game, in the software, all of that. So it certainly can happen. But if we flip through the results, like generally the A770 is significantly behind the 4060. And more than that, I think we're running into issues where many games are seeing terrible 1% lows with spiky frame time graphs. And again, just less predictable sorts of situations happening here. Like with Alan Wake 2, it just wasn't really utilizing the GPU at all. Now, granted, I probably could have spent longer and maybe solved that problem. But the thing with the Arc GPUs is it just, every time I test them out, at least one of the games I run has some kind of major issue. And so that's really my problem is when you're buying AMD and NVIDIA GPUs, they, for the most part, just work. They do occasionally have issues, and usually when they do, there is some kind of fairly simple workaround you can Google. But with the Arc GPUs, sometimes it's just their drivers aren't working, especially if you go like further out of field. Like, I feel like I was throwing pretty much softballs at the Arc GPUs here, given that I'm testing out pretty major games and major game engines, all that have released pretty recently. So I'm not trying to grab some, obscure releases from 8 years ago where Arc is even more likely to have issues and things like that. So unfortunately, my conclusion right now is really just that I'm very hopeful that Arc GPUs will continue to improve, and they have improved a lot, but they still just aren't where I would want them to be for me to be able to recommend them. They would have, I don't even know what they'd have to be performance-wise for me to recommend them over AMD and NVIDIA, because it's just so inconsistent. Like I said, there's some games here where, like, if I was just trying to play Alan Wake 2 on my Arc A770, it's just not working, right? And what if that was a big game I really wanted to play? When Starfield came out, it didn't work at all. Now it works, but not very well. So there's a lot of these situations where it's causing problems. Again, earlier this year when I was testing out The Last of Us Part 1 when it came to PC, couldn't get it to work on my Intel GPUs. Like, it's just too frequently having these problems. So I don't think I can recommend them right now. Now, that being said, there are some promising signs. For example, XeSS upscaling is already a better competitor to DLSS than FSR is. So that is very promising. And also because, how should I put this? When we're thinking about the next generation of Intel GPUs, that's where I have more excitement, because when there's major issues to solve, it means that there's lower hanging fruit for the driver team and even the hardware team to make large generational improvements. If you have a more mature architecture and more mature drivers, that's a good thing, but it also means that it's harder to make gigantic improvements. Whereas it's possible that we could be more likely to see massive generational leap from the next Intel GPUs, just because there are a lot of problems to shore up. Anyway, so I've got to be honest that while it's gotten better, I just still don't think I can recommend most people buying an Intel Arc GPU right now. Until it's just like you can play major releases when they come out and not have problems. And that just doesn't seem to be the case right now, even after a lot of improvement. And that's unfortunate, but that's where we're at. What do you guys think in the comment section? Maybe you have an Arc GPU and you're totally happy with it. Let me know. I can just report on the experience I had testing out the games that I happened to test out in this video. Obviously, GPU use cases are a lot more varied than that. So let me know what you think in the comment section. Huge thank you to viewers, commenters, subscribers, and especially channel members who have clicked the join button to directly support the channel financially. That allows me to do things like, you know, I didn't get sent an Arc a review sample or anything. That was purchased with money from the channel. So again, huge thank you to people for supporting that way. Totally understand not everybody's in a financial position to do that, and that is absolutely fine. And I hope everyone has an excellent day.